Ancient Egypt looks eternal to us, but for the people who actually lived there, it was a world that could fall apart. More than once, the Egyptian state rose, flourished, collapsed into chaos, and then tried to put itself back together again in a new form. One of those rebirths is what historians now call the Middle Kingdom, and its story begins with a catastrophe. Picture Egypt around 2200 BCE. For centuries, it had been a powerful, centralized kingdom stretching along the Nile, ruled from Memphis. In the age of the Great Pyramids, kings poured immense resources into colossal stone tombs. Later, the pyramids became smaller but richer inside, covered with spells and hymns to guide the dead king into the next world. Craftsmen grew more skilled, private tombs multiplied, and it almost seemed as if this system could go on forever. Then, the river failed. At the turn of the 22nd century BCE, the Nile's annual flood began to misbehave, coming in too low, ruining harvests and triggering famine. When the river failed, the state failed with it. The central government could not cope. Storehouses emptied, and regional governors, the nomarchs, stopped listening to Memphis and quietly turned their districts into many kingdoms. In the delta and around the old royal center, order disintegrated into something close to anarchy. At some point, it was simply safer to abandon Memphis than to try to hold it. In a collapsing system, people go first for whatever is rich, close by, and unable to fight back. In Egypt, that meant tombs. As soon as the royal grip weakened, the great cemeteries of the Old Kingdom became targets. Pyramids, royal mastabas, and lavish burials of the elite were broken into and stripped. For us, kings like Khufu and Menkaure are symbols of eternal stone and engineering genius. For later Egyptians, starting from the Middle Kingdom, they could look very different, as rulers who had drained the country for the sake of gigantic tombs that turned out to be lootable and vulnerable. But the real shock was not only economic, it was theological. In Old Kingdom Egypt, the king was not just a ruler, but a living god. People prayed to him for good harvests, for children, for justice and order. Temples and mortuary cults existed so that, after death, he would live forever and continue to support Egypt from the other side. If all that cosmic machinery suddenly stopped working, if the Nile failed, hunger spread, and violence filled the land, an uncomfortable question appeared. If the king is a god, why is everything falling apart? That question comes through in a new kind of literature that appears later in the Middle Kingdom. For the first time, Egyptians write not just dry royal annals about victories and building projects, but reflective, almost philosophical texts about what it feels like when the world collapses. One of the most famous is known today as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, where the world has turned upside down. The poor are rich, the rich wear rags, and people openly say they no longer understand what is happening to their country. Most striking of all is how some of these texts dare to talk about the king. In the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, the Pharaoh is a cosmic predator who devours other gods and absorbs their power, a being almost beyond human categories. In Ipuwar's laments, someone can speak to the king almost like to a failed shepherd. Where are you while we are dying? What kind of ruler lets his flock starve? For the first time, the idea appears that a pharaoh might fail at being a god, that not every king automatically deserves that title. While the political system was falling apart, something else was quietly shifting in the Egyptian view of the afterlife. The old pyramid texts were essentially secret manuals for a dead king, spells carved inside royal pyramids to guide him through the dangerous landscape of the next world. For centuries, they belonged only to the pharaoh. But when the pyramids were robbed and their interiors exposed, those once exclusive spells suddenly became available to others. Scribes began copying and adapting them for private use. That was a revolution. For the first time, the promise of a structured, well-equipped afterlife began to extend beyond the royal family. The old formulas were reworked into what are now called the coffin texts, spells and instructions written inside wooden coffins for non-royal elites. The layout itself tells the story. The texts run along the inner surfaces of the coffin lid, directly above where the body lies. You wake up in your tomb. Open your painted eyes facing east, and right above you are the directions for what to do next. The Egyptians were not bothered by having more than one model of the afterlife at the same time. One strand was the solar vision. The soul joins the sun god Ra, sails with him across the sky by day, and through the dangerous underworld by night. Another, which grows stronger in this period, is the Osirian vision. Osiris, a god who dies and is resurrected, becomes lord of the dead, of fertile fields, and of just judgment. In this Osirian framework, eternal life is no longer just a bonus that comes automatically with a royal crown. It starts to depend on preparation and on how you lived. Coffin text spells describe a detailed, hazardous landscape. Fields, gates, guardians, and hostile beings whose very names promise trouble. The soul can get lost, end up in the wrong region of the next world, and spend eternity in very unpleasant company. Or, if properly equipped and morally acceptable, it can reach the lush fields of offerings and live there under the protection of Osiris. Alongside this, another idea slowly crystallizes: judgment. The heart of the deceased can be weighed, evaluated, found light or heavy. Later, in the famous Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom, that scene becomes highly formalized, with scales, a feather of Ma'at, and monsters waiting to devour the unworthy. But the roots of that vision are already growing here, as Egypt tries to make sense of why the old world fell apart, and what, if anything, a human life should be judged by, both in this world and in the next. So by the time Egypt begins to pull itself together again, it is not quite the same country. The geography of power has shifted. Faith in the automatic divinity of the king has been shaken, and ideas about the afterlife have opened up beyond the palace walls. Out of famine, political breakup, and spiritual doubt, a different Egypt will emerge, and it will rise not from Memphis in the north, but from a new power center in the south. From the outside, it might look as if Egypt has finally found a stable formula. Strong central power, a disciplined bureaucracy, controlled borders, and a clear religious story that ties king, gods, and ordinary people into one system. In reality, that stability is more fragile than it seems. Behind the facade of order, problems are slowly building up. Succession becomes less clear. Local elites quietly regain weight, and the carefully balanced machine of the 12th dynasty starts to creak. As the 13th dynasty unfolds, Egypt technically remains a single kingdom, but the kings change too often and leave too few impressive monuments. Authority from the throne still exists on paper, yet in the Delta and on the periphery, real power is drifting toward local rulers and immigrant elites. In the eastern Delta, the mixed Levantine Egyptian population around Avaris grows into something like a state within a state, with its own military resources, trade networks, and ambitions. Step by step, this parallel center of power turns from foreign quarter into an alternative kingship. Its leaders adopt royal titles, use Egyptian symbols, and present themselves as legitimate pharaohs, even though later tradition will remember them as alien usurpers. These are the people later Egyptians call the Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands who will dominate the north while native dynasties cling to Thebes in the south. Their rise marks the end of the Middle Kingdom and the beginning of a new age of division, the Second Intermediate Period. In a way, the Middle Kingdom ends where the next story begins. The stage is set, a weakened native throne, powerful local elites, and a rising foreign court in the Delta that calls itself Egyptian but is remembered as anything but. Out of this tension will come new wars, new heroes, and another rebirth of Egypt under a very different kind of king. In the next video, the focus will shift to that troubled age, the Second Intermediate Period, and the Hyksos. There will be a closer look at how they actually ruled, what they changed in Egyptian warfare and technology, and how the Theban line eventually fought back to found the new kingdom.